Today we're reviewing quadratic formula and the square root method. So if you know how to do this, you can skip this video and just start working on the assignment. But if you need help, I'm going to go through these first three examples. We want to remember that we can only use the square root method on problems that have only the x squared. It doesn't have an x term. What I'd like you to do now is look at all of our examples on both sides, and I would like you to highlight or circle your x terms, because then we know we cannot do the square root method. So for example, on this first one, there's just x squared, no x terms. On the second one, there's an x squared term, no other x's. But on this one, I see an x term. So I'm going to highlight that, and you can circle it if you don't have a highlighter. When I look at my next example, I can see that I have an x term, so I'm going to highlight that. In this term right here, you can see that I don't have an x term. There's no just an x squared. Here I see that I have the x term. So do that on the other side as well, just to kind of give you a heads up that, hey, this is one that I'm going to want to use the quadratic formula for. I've zoomed into the top half of the page. So remember with square root method, if we have just an x squared all by itself, we are ready to do the square root. We can square root both sides. Don't forget when you square root that it needs to be plus or minus. But here I'm going to have the square root of x squared gives me just x, and the square root of 25. 25 is a perfect square of just 5, and I don't want to forget my plus or minus. So on your line, you can write your answer. On part B, this does not have the x term, so we can use the same method, but before we do that, we have to get the x squared by itself. So I'm going to start by adding 30 to both sides. So I have 3x squared, that canceled out, and I'm left with 30. Now I can divide both sides by 3, and I have x squared is equal to 10. Now that I have the x squared by itself, I am ready to square root both sides, and the square root cancels out the squares, so I'm left with x. And I want to look at, can 10 be simplified? So some of you are doing the factor tree, some of you are dividing it out like this. When I divide it out into its factors, I just have 2 and 5 as the prime factors, and there are no pairs. So no pairs means there are no perfect squares. So that means it's already simplified. So I have my plus or minus. I forgot my plus or minus up here. So my answer is just plus and minus root 10. On part C, I cannot use the same method. I have to use the quadratic formula here. So the first thing I do for quadratic formula would be to find my A, B, and C. My A is 1, my B is negative 1. Remember, when there's no coefficient here, it's like there's a 1 there. Keep the sign. And then my C value is negative 3. And let's put the quadratic formula at the top of the page. X is equal to the opposite of B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC all over 2A. Of course, you can sing it to Pop Goes the Weasel. You don't want to hear me do that. So x is going to equal the opposite of negative 1. The opposite of negative 1 is positive 1. Plus or minus the square root of negative 1 squared minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is negative 3, all over 2 times a, which is 1. And we're going to do some simplifying here. So 1 plus or minus. You can put this whole thing in your calculator as it is. Just make sure you're using parentheses. Since I don't have a calculator pulled up here, I'm going to do it step by step. Negative 1 squared is 1. And then I'm subtracting, and I have 2 negatives here. So that means when I multiply that all together, it's going to be a positive. And 4 times 1 times 3 is 12. And that's all over 2 times 1 or 2. 1 plus or minus. Now this is the square root of 13. And 13 you'll recognize as a prime number, so I don't have any more simplifying that I can do. So I'm going to write that as my answer. So note you have 2 answers for each one of these because we're solving quadratics, and x squareds typically have 2 answers. You will finish this assignment and turn it in. take a quick peek at the backside. Make sure that your highlights match mine. Remember, if it's highlighted, we cannot use the square root method for that.